Take a moment to look around the room where you sit. You feel safe within your four walls, don't you? You see the door, the window, the hallway. Your home is honest. It shows you everything. But if you were to step back through the mist of time into the heart of a grand Victorian mansion in 1870, you would realize that the house was lying to you. Every elegant room, every mahogany-paneled library was a stage set, designed to hide a dark, parallel world operating just inches from your shoulder. Before we descend into this architectural labyrinth, I invite you to join our circle by the fire. If you find comfort in the secrets of the past, please leave a mark of your presence. Like this chronicle, share it with those who seek refuge in history, and let us know in the comments. Would you have the courage to sleep in a house that breathes behind its walls? Your engagement is the lantern that guides us through these forgotten halls. I want you to challenge your perception of luxury. You see a Victorian manor and you think of wealth, of chandeliers, and of grand staircases. But I ask you, would you survive a week in a home built on a foundation of systemic erasure? You think your modern life is complicated. The Victorians turned architecture into a weapon of social engineering. They lived in an era where the greatest fear wasn't a ghost in the attic, but a servant being seen. To solve this problem, they built a second house inside the first one, a maze of false walls and secret passages where thousands of human beings lived and moved like ghosts, never allowed to cast a shadow on the master's floor. Imagine standing in a grand dining room. The table is set with silver, the candles are lit, and the air is filled with the scent of roasted pheasant. You see no servants. Then, a panel in the wall, seamlessly integrated into the woodwork, slides open an inch. A hand appears, places a dish, and vanishes. This was the Invisible Labyrinth. Behind that wood was a corridor so narrow 2 people could barely pass, unlit, unventilated, and coated in coal soot. The Victorians were obsessed with the illusion of solitude. They spent fortunes building back stairs and blind doors so that a maid carrying a heavy bucket of coal would never offend the eyes of a lady. It was the world's first human hardware, where the staff were treated like the wiring in a wall, essential but a nuisance to behold. But the deception went deeper than social status. It turned the very air of the home into a silent executioner. Here is a terrifying fact: the most beautiful thing in a Victorian room was often the most lethal. We speak of home decor today as a matter of taste, but in 1860, it was a matter of toxicology. The vibrant, deep greens that the wealthy loved, the famous Shields green, were made with arsenic. And because Victorian houses were designed to be airtight to trap heat, the walls literally breathed poison. When the damp London air hit that wallpaper, it released arsenic gas. People would go to bed in their sanctuaries and wake up with failing lungs, or they wouldn't wake up at all. They were being murdered by their own aesthetics, trapped in a gilded cage of emerald dust. You think your home is loud? The Victorians had a soundproof nightmare to maintain. In an age where surgeries were often performed on the kitchen table and melancholy family members were hidden away, the walls had to be thick, not for privacy, but for silence. They used horsehair, lead, and thick plaster to ensure that the screams from an amateur amputation or the cries of a locked-away relative would never reach the ears of guests drinking tea in the parlor. Every mansion had its secret sick room, a space that appeared as a mere closet on the blueprints, but held the tragedies the family refused to acknowledge. The sentence of death was the price of beauty in the 1800s. We look at these mansions and see romantic ruins, but they were actually sophisticated machines of deception. Behind the dumbwaiter's wooden door was a vertical shaft that acted as a chimney for disease, carrying the bacteria of the basement to the nursery in the attic. They were living in a paradox, a world that sought to be the most civilized in history, yet built homes that functioned like medieval dungeons with a coat of velvet paint. But as the fire burns low and the shadows in the corners of this room grow longer, you must realize that the invisible corridors were just the beginning. For behind the false walls lay something far more visceral than a servant's passage. I urge you to stay with us until the very end, for the next revelation involves the great stink that lived inside the walls, and a secret that will make you grateful for every breath of clean air you take tonight. The fire is sputtering now, its orange glow fighting against the creeping chill of the London night. We have walked through the hidden corridors where the living were erased, but now we must confront a far more intimate intruder. In our modern world, we take for granted the invisible mechanics of our homes, the silent pipes, the filtered vents, the effortless flow of air that we never have to think about. But in the mid-1800s, the Victorian mansion was a living, breathing organism, and the breath it drew was often foul, stagnant, and laden with the scent of the grave. I want you to imagine the miasma channels. To the Victorian mind, disease was not caused by germs, a concept still too small for them to grasp, but by miasma, the deadly, invisible vapor of decay. They believed that if you could smell the rot, you were already dying. To combat this, architects designed elaborate, hidden ventilation systems, hollow voids between the false walls and decorative cornices meant to whisk away the foul air. But these channels, built with the best of intentions, became the city's secret arteries of death. Because the mansions were heated by coal fires in every room, the house acted like a giant chimney, sucking the air up from the damp, waste-filled basements and pulling it through the very walls where the family slept. Here is a terrifying fact. The Great Stink of 1858 didn't just stay in the River Thames, it lived inside the masonry of the homes. Because plumbing was a new and poorly understood luxury, the pipes were often just lead or ceramic tubes that leaked directly into the hollow spaces behind the mahogany panels. Imagine lying in your four-poster bed surrounded by silk and gold, while just 3 inches from your head, the fermented waste of the household seeped into the lath and plaster. The walls weren't just partitions, they were sponges for bacteria. You weren't just breathing air, you were breathing the concentrated essence of a city that had no place to put its filth. And what of the dust eaters? In the narrow gaps between the rooms, where the ventilation shafts met the servants' passages, a layer of black coal dust and human dander accumulated for decades. This wasn't the harmless dust of a modern bookshelf. This was a combustible, toxic soot that acted as a highway for vermin. Rats, the size of small cats, moved through these invisible labyrinths with total freedom, carrying fleas from the slums directly into the nurseries of the elite. The Victorians built grand stone facades to project an image of permanence, but the interiors were hollowed out by these crawlspaces, creating a literal infrastructure of infestation. You think your home is a sanctuary? The Victorian safe room was often anything but. To keep the cold out, they sealed their windows with heavy putty and draped them in thick, dust-trapping velvet. This created a stagnant chamber, a room where the air was never truly replaced, only recycled through the poisoned wallpaper and the leaking vents. This is why the White Plague, tuberculosis, ravaged the upper classes just as ruthlessly as the poor. They were suffocating in their own luxury, trapped in a cycle of sanitary deception, where the more they tried to hide the miasma, the more they invited it to stay. The dumbwaiter, which we previously saw as a marvel of service, was actually the spine of infection. These vertical shafts created a perfect draft, pulling the damp, mold-spore-laden air from the scullery and delivering it to every floor. If a servant in the basement had a cough, the architecture of the house ensured that every resident inhaled the same pathogens by dinner time. It was a world where the comfort of the modern world was a lethal illusion, a society that spent millions to hide the sight of labor while ignoring the smell of the morgue. But as the gaslight flickers and the silence of the night deepens, you must realize that the poisoned air was only one layer of the mansion's deception. For if the walls held the breath of the city, the sanctuary of shadows held its fears. I urge you to stay with us until the very end, for as we move into the next chapter, we will uncover the secret vaults and safe rooms where the Victorians hid the things they feared most, and why some of those doors were meant to be locked from the outside. Subscribe and join our circle, for the shadows are growing and the true face of the Victorian home is about to be revealed. The fire has burned down to a low, pulsing crimson, and the shadows in the corners of our library seem to lean in, as if eager to hear what we have suppressed. We have spoken of the servants who lived as ghosts and the air that carried a silent sentence of death, but now we must confront the true sanctuary of shadows. In our modern age, we pride ourselves on transparency. We share our lives on digital stages and build our homes with open plans and glass walls. But the Victorian heart was a fortress of secrets, and their mansions were designed to be vaults for the things and the people they feared most. I want you to imagine the safe room of the 1870s. It wasn't built for a natural disaster or a common thief. It was built for the family's shame. You see, the Victorian obsession with respectability was so intense that any deviance, be it mental illness, a scandalous pregnancy, or a physical deformity, was treated as a stain that could destroy the family's standing in the empire. To solve this, the invisible labyrinth we discussed earlier was used for a far darker purpose. Behind a bookshelf in the library or a heavy mirror in the dressing room, there were rooms that didn't exist on the public blueprints. These were the hidden sick rooms. Here's a terrifying fact. Many Victorian mansions contained a sanctuary where a family member might be kept for 20 years without ever seeing the sun. We are not talking about a medieval dungeon, but a room lined with velvet and mahogany, filled with the finest furniture, yet lacking a single handle on the inside of the door. To the outside world, the relative had gone to the continent for their health or retired to a quiet cottage in the country. In reality, they were pacing the floorboards just 3 feet away from a dinner party, their muffled cries dismissed by the host as the wind in the old pipes. This was the architecture of erasure, taken to its ultimate, cruel conclusion, a world where you were better off dead than being a source of social embarrassment. But the fear didn't just come from within. It hammered at the gates from the outside. The Victorian elite lived in constant terror of the mob. They remembered the fires of the French Revolution and watched the rising tide of the working class with a cold, shaking hand. This fear gave birth to the internal fortification. Behind the elegant plasterwork of the grand staircase, architects installed hidden iron shutters that could be triggered by a single lever, turning a family home into a windowless bunker in seconds. They built secret vaults beneath the floorboards, not just for silver and gold, but for survival rations, a place to hide should the invisible class in the walls ever decide to rise up and reclaim the house. You think your home is a place of peace? For the Victorian, the house was a psychological battlefield. They were internal refugees, trapped in a cycle of paranoia where the very walls they built for protection became their own cages. The sanctuary of shadows was a place where the family's darkest truths were interred, protected by thick masonry and the unspoken vow of silence that bound the household together. It was a society that valued the gilded mask over the human heart, and the mansions they left behind are mausoleums of suppressed stories. The hidden rooms were not just architectural curiosities, they were the physical manifestation of a mind that could not face itself. But as the gaslight grows dim and the frost begins to bloom on the window panes, we must move toward the most harrowing threshold of all. For if the safe rooms held the family's shame, the infirmary of silence held their agony. I invite you to share this journey with another soul who finds beauty in the darkness. Your share is the spark that keeps our fire from going out. Stay with us until the final dawn breaks, for we are about to enter the room that no one ever wanted to visit. The place where the surgeon's saw met the secret of the walls, and the miracle of the 19th century revealed its blood-stained hands. The fire is dying now, the embers glowing like the eyes of a beast in the dark. We have seen the rooms built for shame and the corridors built for ghosts, but we must now step into the most terrifying space of all, the infirmary of silence. In our world, the hospital is a place of sterile white light, a sanctuary of machines that beep with life. But for the Victorian elite, the hospital was a place of last resort, a squalid house of death for the poor. If you were a person of standing, your hospital was your home. Your bedroom was the operating theater, and your family was the audience to your agony. I want you to imagine the home surgery of 1880. You are lying in your bed, the very room where you sleep and dream. But today it has been transformed. The fine linen has been stripped away and replaced with oilcloth to catch the blood. Your family has moved the dumbwaiter to the highest floor so the servants won't hear your cries. But as we know, those hollow shafts only act as a megaphone for the trauma. This was the theater of blood. Inside the home, a secret ritual performed in the heart of the mansion, hidden behind those thick, soundproof walls we discussed. Here's a terrifying fact. Because anesthesia was still a dangerous and unpredictable novelty, the Victorian surgeon's greatest skill was not his precision, but his speed. We are used to surgeries that last hours, but a Victorian amputation had to be completed in under 60 seconds to prevent the patient from dying of pure shock. Imagine the scene. The surgeon arrives in his black carriage, his frock coat encrusted with the dried blood of previous patients, a badge of experience in an age that didn't understand germs. He opens his bag of silver-handled saws right there on your vanity table, next to your perfume and your jewelry. He does not wash his hands. He does not clean the blade. He simply rolls up his sleeves and asks your father to hold your shoulders. You think your healthcare is expensive? The Victorians paid a far higher price. The price of institutional ignorance. Because the elite insisted on being treated at home, they were often in more danger than the poor. In a hospital, a doctor might see 100 cases of a fever. In a mansion, the family physician was often an old friend who treated your nervous exhaustion with mercury and lead-based tinctures, unaware that the very medicine he prescribed was slowly rotting your brain. This was the miracle of the 19th century, at its most barbaric, a world where the wealthy died in luxury of diseases that a simple piece of soap could have prevented. But the infirmary of silence wasn't just for physical wounds. It was the final stop for the hysterical and the melancholic. If a daughter refused to marry or a son showed signs of what we now know as autism, they were brought to this room. Here, behind the false walls, they were subjected to the rest cure. Weeks of total isolation in the dark, forbidden from reading, writing, or speaking. The Victorian home was designed to be a sanctuary, but for many, it became a sensory deprivation chamber, a place where the mind was broken in the name of keeping the family's public image intact. The walls of these mansions have ears, they say, but in the Victorian era, the walls had memories of screams that were never supposed to be heard. But as the last of the coal in our grate turns to gray ash, we must reach the final threshold. For the ultimate deception of the Victorian home was not how it helped you live, but how it prepared you to die. I invite you to subscribe to our circle and join the thousands who seek refuge in these dark chronicas. Your support is the only thing that keeps the mist from swallowing these stories forever. Stay with me for the final dawn, for we are about to uncover the legacy of the threshold, and why, after seeing the truth, you will never look at an old house the same way again. The fire has finally surrendered, leaving only a skeletal glow of gray and silver in the grate. The room has grown cold, the kind of cold that seems to rise from the floorboards like a memory of a winter long forgotten. We have navigated the hidden arteries of the Victorian mansion. We have seen the invisible servants, breathed the poisoned air of the miasma channels, and stood in the silent rooms built for shame and surgery. Now, we reach the final threshold. In our modern world, we treat death as a clinical event, something that happens elsewhere, in sterile buildings far from our dinner tables. But for the Victorian, the home was not just a place to live. It was a cathedral of mourning, a structure designed to facilitate the grand, final theater of departure. I want you to imagine the death of the house. When the master or mistress finally succumbed to the white plague, or the surgeon's unwashed saw, the mansion itself underwent a physical transformation. This was the mourning ritual of 1890. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, plunging the rooms into a permanent twilight. Every mirror in the house, those expensive, blurry metal discs we discussed, was covered in black crepe. Why? Because they believed that the soul, in its moment of release, could become trapped in the reflection, or that the living might see the face of the deceased staring back from the silvered glass. The house became a tomb before the body was even cold. Here is a terrifying fact. The Victorian home was often more alive when someone was dead. Because they were obsessed with the respectability of grief, the family would commission post-mortem photographs. They would bring the deceased back into the drawing room, prop their eyes open, and pose them with the living as if they were merely nodding off to sleep. We find this macabre, even ghoulish, But to them, it was the only way to freeze the image of a loved one in an era where life was as fragile as a porcelain cup. The mansion was a repository of these shadow families, a place where the dead and the living shared the same corridors, separated only by a thin veil of black silk and the silence of the false walls. You think your life is heavy with burdens? The Victorian was weighed down by the tax of the soul. The cost of a proper funeral could bankrupt a middle-class family for a decade. They would pay for mutes, professional mourners who stood at the door in frozen, silent grief and draped their horses in black feathers. Even the house itself seemed to groan under the weight of the black crepe and the scent of lilies, which were used not for beauty, but to mask the great stink of the body that remained in the parlor for days of viewing. It was a culture that refused to let go, building houses that were as much about preserving the past as they were about sheltering the future. But as the first pale light of a modern dawn begins to bleed through your window, I want you to take a deep, clear breath. Look at your walls. They are thin, honest, and free of arsenic. Look at your hallway. It is bright, and no one is forced to move through it like a ghost. We have walked through the valley of the shadow of the 19th century, and it is time to return to the miracle of the present. The alivio du ritorno, the relief of the return, is the true treasure of our journey tonight. You survived. You survived the invisible labyrinth and the poisoned wallpaper. You survived the infirmary of silence and the fear of the mob outside the iron shutters. As you feel the warmth of your modern home, let a profound sense of gratitude settle into your bones. The stress of your digital life, the anxiety of your schedule, these are mere whispers compared to the visceral, blood-soaked reality of the ancestors who huddled behind those mahogany panels, praying that the miasma wouldn't claim their children before the sun rose. They built these grand, deceptive monuments of stone so that we wouldn't have to. As we extinguish the very last ember and step back into the safety of the 21st century, I want to thank you for your courage. Your curiosity is the light that keeps these forgotten souls from being erased by time. If this journey into the hidden architecture of death has moved you, I invite you to share this chronicle with another seeker of truth. And before the mist claims our path, tell me in the comments, would you have the strength to live in a house that kept so many secrets? Or do you find comfort in the transparency of our modern world? Your voice is the final word in this story. Until the gaslight flickers again, stay safe, stay grateful, and remember, sometimes the walls really do have stories to tell.